the name of the one God, Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer. Amen. I want to welcome all of you to this worship this morning, and no, we are not going to be praying for either team at the Super Bowl today. I really appreciate the fact that on this most sacred of American secular holidays, you have chosen to be here this morning. And it's not just that, it's a perfect day for us to take note of our culture's most sacred values this Super Bowl Sunday. Whether it's being the meanest linebacker or the best quarterback in the league, whoever gets the bonuses today is going to make several millions of dollars. The biggest shark in the financial world is the one we look up to. Didn't Jamie Dimon just get the boardroom of Chase Morgan to give him a raise after losing $6 billion in fines against his company? He got a raise. How about the Walton family, whose wealth again multiplied this year? And last year and the year before that for underpaying their workers and denying health coverage to their employees. That's the way to make money. And we think they're successful businesses. We urge them on. We Americans seem on this way to glorify the audacity of successful, aggressive, cutthroat, dog-eat-dog living. The red in tooth and claw winnings of the best. The kill or be killed at any cost that the most powerful get, and they get all that they deserve and more. And the rest of us are losers. They seem to be our heroes. Think about that. They are the models our kids are using to become like them when they grow up. These are our models. They're the image of making it, of being successful in our society. Climb that ladder over whosever body you need to climb and continue stomping until you get to the top. And we'll pay you handsomely for it. So of all the days of the year, our lectionary lessons this morning seem to expose us to a seemingly nonsensical set of readings that includes our beloved text from Matthew, which we call the Beatitudes, the blessings. Even St. Paul in his letter to the Corinthians calls this foolishness. And that's what it is. Foolishness. How in heaven's name are we to make sense of much of this? Much less finding any way of embracing these words of Jesus from the Sermon on the Mount. As I was preparing from this morning's sermon, I went ahead and I read the whole sermon. Go home and read it. It'll make you really depressed. All I can say is that Jesus never was a parish priest in the Episcopal Church, because he would have never made it through this sermon and had a congregation that continued pledging. If I could preach that kind of a sermon, I'd be really in trouble. As a whole, I would say homiletically that Jesus is not a very good news preacher. Rather, His words are seemingly a long laundry list of difficult, if not impossible, directives, which, if followed, seem to ensure that if you're pretty miserable, you're going to be more miserable, at least according to the values of our culture. Is it any wonder that I suspect most people listen to these words of Jesus very politely, nod our heads reverently, as if we really like what we're hearing, and then again, politely, of course, and quietly, of course, completely ignore any claims that these words might make on us. Instead, we manage to concoct a so-called religion of acceptance, which basically reduces discipleship to being a nice, tolerant, and relatively decent neighbor. Not a bad thing. You wouldn't cheat on anybody, at least on a personal level. You wouldn't act hatefully to anybody. Perhaps those are the things we need to carry out in our lives. And if we did that, maybe we'd be okay. But in this view, to be religious, to be a person of religion, seems to me at least to be reduced to somehow being a good middle-class citizen in our society. Nothing wrong with that. But it isn't what Jesus is talking about. So back to Jesus and his ridiculous sermonizing and his equally ridiculous claims that we will be blessed, honored. Some would say in the translation of his word there, happy, if we were living lives of mournful meekness, hungering and thirsting for right, struggling to make peace, downtrodden in our own spirit and merciful in a world that is a dog-eat-dog world of merciless competition. Talk about being losers. This could easily be heard as a prescription for being a loser in our world. And yet these are the very actions, according to Jesus' first sermon, of a life lived in alignment with the will of the divine. Now try to make sense out of that. This is the vision of God's kingdom to which we are called as Christians. Is it any wonder that some people think Christianity might be the best idea that a very few people have ever tried? Consider this latest surprise of our culture's newest rock star obsession. Of all people, who do we see on the front cover of Time magazine? Our new Pope Francis. And believe it or not, he continues to make headlines throughout the world, turning all sorts of heads and making religion's most hardened cynics think twice. Simply because he has begun to talk about the fact that what Jesus might be saying to us in our generation in the Sermon on the Mount might well not just be relevant, but perhaps even revolutionary. A real challenge to the way our world works. Notice that he was quickly labeled a subversive. Notice that he was quickly labeled a Marxist, a hopeless idealist by our culture's guardians of correct and political thinking, for even suggesting that poverty and domination and oppression and the dominance of will and power and wealth might not be a permanent reality for our world, much less God's will for us. Perhaps we need to stop for a minute. Just stop and listen. Listen carefully to Jesus' words to those of us who are here this morning. What Jesus seems to be inviting us to is a vision of an alternative world, an upside-down world, a world where we humans are actually intended to care for and to serve and honor each other in respect and dignity. What a thought. Where all of us, rich and poor, black and white, intelligent and dull, male, female, gay, straight, able and disabled, a world where we will be capable and able to live out the fullness of what God intends each of us to be in peace and in dignity. That's quite a vision. It's a vision of a world that sees the overwhelming reality of God's life in the world as being incredible abundance. Abundance. Not lack. Not loss. Not never enough. But abundance, more than we can ever need. That this creation of ours was made to give us everything we need to have. And that we were made to share it, rather than it being a shrinking private treasure to be hoarded, protected, restricted, and fought over. The world in which God's reign shall win out, and the community this God calls us into, is God's dream for us. According to Jesus, it's not just a possible dream and vision out there. The reality is that Jesus says we are participating in it. It's us. It's in us. The kingdom of God is within all of us. It's really who we are. Yes, this seems like an upside-down thing, but that's because perhaps most of us have spent all of our lives, and I'll include myself in this, selling our souls for a mess of pottage. We've turned our backs on the birthright of being beloved children of God, given every good gift. And notice, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, these words that he speaks are not words to the crowds. The crowds aren't there when Jesus talks about this business. The Beatitudes are spoken only to his chosen disciples, only to those whom Jesus is training to take up the cause of the kingdom with him. And perhaps, maybe, this story gives us reason to understand that the crowds might be looking for something different, something more flashy, something more along the lines of their expectations of power and dominance, of control and violence. They're looking for some powerful hero to rise up and crush the power of Roman domination and oppression. They're desperate. They're looking for someone to save them, but they're looking in the wrong place. No, Jesus speaks to a small, hand-picked band of disciples. And these instructions that we hear today are not for everybody. They are for those who are willing to retrain their hearts and minds, their eyes and their ears of their souls and spirits to engage in this new vision of God's beloved community. The crowds may want someone else to lead them to the good life, but they will ultimately refuse this vision that Jesus offers. We know that. For what Jesus tells us in the Beatitudes is that the honor and the blessing and the sense of spiritual well-being that come from living into this vision of God's new community is not something that everyone wants to embrace. It's not the world of domination and power. It's not the world of wealth and grandeur. It's a world that finds itself amid the shadows of suffering, amid the brokenness of hearts, amid the hungering for righteousness that seeks peace and offers mercy in a world of judgment, conflict, and alienation. We in this community who call ourselves Jesus people are being challenged to listen again, as we are always needing to be challenged to listen again, always needing to be challenged to open our hearts again, to glimpse here and there and to practice over and over again those little random acts of kindness, those little acts of mercy and justice and peacemaking that bring the breaking dawn of the kingdom that is always beyond us and yet always within us. Each time we embrace those who suffer, each time we hold and comfort those who mourn and share their tears, each time we reach out and cross the chasm of anger and alienation and violence, each time we offer ourselves to the dangerous struggle of making peace, each time we choose to stand for righteousness and justice, each time we seek to protect God's creation, we should simply expect that the world we live in will doubtlessly look upon us as wild-eyed yet pathetic idealists destined to be losers. That's how the world will see us when we're doing what we're supposed to be doing. Yet this is precisely what and how we're called to live, just keeping on doing it. We must relearn our capacity to hear the music of the songs of freedom and compassion that we have learned from those who have gone before us, to witness as they did, to take up their melodies and join in their singing the songs of the saints. And we must constantly remind ourselves of the incessant seductions to power and to wealth and to success and domination that assault all of us, each of us, every single day. How are we to live in this household of the divine love? What should our values and priorities be? These are the questions for the ongoing process of forming ourselves, the difficult and disciplined process of forming ourselves into the image of Christ, of discipleship. We are listening to Jesus today over the shoulders of those first disciples, over those first followers. His words to them and to us are once and now clear, straightforward, and deceptively simple. We are called to carry them within our hearts as we are called to act, always to act as Jesus would act. We are invited to let these words enter our hearts and take roots as seeds of the kingdom as our new identity as Jesus people. Notice I don't say Christians anymore, because I think the word's been declaimed. We are called not as isolated individuals, not as heroic figures, but to live as a community of love and forgiveness and compassion, and to give each other as a gift, to bind up each other's brokenness, to remind each other of God's unconditional love and presence and acceptance, Jesus says in these words of the Beatitude that when and where we manage to do this, we will indeed find ourselves in the presence of a reality, surrounded by a sense of well-being, of blessedness. That's the promise of Jesus.